There is a moment so subtle that most people never even notice when it happens, and yet, it changes everything. Not because something external occurred, not because your life suddenly shifted, but because something within you began to move, almost as if an invisible layer had been removed, even if only for a few seconds. And maybe you felt this before, not as something extraordinary, but as something so simple that the mind overlooked it. Maybe it happened while you were looking at the sky without thinking about anything in particular, or while you were walking, and for a brief moment, there was no past and no future. Or maybe in a moment of deep exhaustion, when you no longer had the energy to keep trying. And it was exactly there that something happened. Because when effort softens, when trying weakens, when control fails, something that has always been there finally reveals itself. But not as an event, as a state without name, without form, without explanation. A state where you are not trying to be someone, not trying to understand, not trying to get anywhere. And for a few moments, there is only silence. But not the silence of the world, the silence of the mind, the silence behind thought, the silence that does not depend on anything to exist. Now, let me ask you something that may seem simple, but carries something much deeper than it appears. Have you ever noticed the exact moment a thought arises? Not after it's already there, but right before. There is a point, a nearly imperceptible space, between one thought and the next, an interval, and that interval is not empty. It is silent, but not empty. It is full of presence. Yet the mind is not trained to notice it. It is trained to fill, to interpret, to react. It does not know how to rest in that space. Because to the mind, that space seems useless. It seems like absence. But in truth, it is exactly the opposite. That space is where everything begins. And also where everything ends. But here is the point that changes everything. You do not need to create this space. You do not need to achieve this silence. You do not need to do anything for it to exist. It is already here. Right now, while you are listening to this, between one word and another, between one breath and the next, between one thought and the next. So then, if it has always been here, why does it feel so difficult to notice it? Why does it feel like we need to make so much effort, meditate, control, seek, to touch something that is already present? The answer may not be comfortable, because maybe the problem was never the absence of silence, but the excess of effort, the excess of movement, the excess of I need to do something, because the mind deeply believes that everything must be achieved, that everything must be reached, that everything depends on continuous effort. But silence does not work that way. It does not respond to effort. It does not appear when you try. In fact, the more you try to reach it, the further away it seems, and this creates a cycle, a silent cycle but constant. You try to be still and notice that you can't, so you try harder, and the more you try, the more noise you notice. And the more noise you notice, the more you believe you need to do something about it. And without realizing, you enter an endless movement of seeking, a movement that never ends, because it is sustained by an idea, a very subtle idea, but extremely powerful. Not yet. I'm not there yet. There's still something missing. And that idea keeps you moving. But let me show you something that can change this completely. What if what you call noise is not the problem? What if the problem is not the thoughts but your relationship with them? Because think about it. A thought appears automatically without you choosing, without you asking. It simply arises. And the moment it appears, something happens. You engage with it. You believe it. You follow it. And that is what creates the movement. But what if, for a moment, you didn't follow? What if you simply noticed, without trying to stop it, without trying to change it, without trying to control it, just noticing? What would happen? Maybe nothing, or maybe something profound. Because the moment you don't engage, something becomes clear. The thought passes, but you remain. The movement happens, but something in you does not move. And that something is silent, but not fragile. It is stable, constant, always present, just rarely recognized. And this is where a real shift begins. Because when this starts to be seen, even in brief moments, your relationship with the mind changes. You no longer need to fight it. You no longer need to control it. You no longer need to silence it. Because you begin to see that silence was never absent. It was only covered by movement, by identification, by habit. And as this becomes clearer, something very interesting happens. You begin to stop seeking, not because you gave up, but because you realized there is nothing to reach. And this may feel strange at first, because it goes against everything you've learned. But there is a freedom in this. A very quiet freedom. Very subtle, but deeply real. And still, the mind will try to come back. It will try to understand. It will try to turn this into a method. It will ask, how do I keep this? How do I make this last? How do I reach this permanently? And this is exactly where something very important still needs to be seen. Because there is a misunderstanding, a nearly invisible detail, that causes many people to come very close, but not cross. And that is what we are about to explore next. There is a point, very delicate, where all of this begins to feel clearer, but also more confusing, because up to this point, it feels like you're starting to understand something. You begin to see that silence doesn't need to be created, that it is already here, that it has always been, and yet, something still tries to turn this into a goal. Do you notice that? It's as if one part of you says, yes, this makes sense, yes, I can feel this, yes, there is something here. But at the same time, another part comes in, a more subtle one, quieter, but deeply conditioned, and it asks, how do I stay in this? How do I not lose this? How do I live like this all the time? And here, almost without noticing, the movement begins again, but now it is more refined, more sophisticated, harder to detect, because before, you were seeking external things, experiences, results, changes. Now you are seeking something internal, a state, a feeling, a kind of presence. But still, it is seeking, and that is exactly what keeps the cycle alive, because there is something very important that has not yet been fully seen. Any attempt to maintain silence is already movement. Any attempt to sustain a state is already effort. Any attempt to not lose this is already born from fear. And where there is fear, there is no silence. Now look at this very carefully, because this is one of the most subtle points of the entire process. You have a moment of presence, a moment of silence, something real, something alive, and immediately after, a thought appears, I need to keep this, and in that exact moment, without realizing, you step out, not because silence disappeared, but because you returned to movement, returned to control, returned to trying. And what's most interesting is that this happens almost automatically because we've been conditioned this way. From a very early age, we learned that anything valuable must be maintained, protected, secured, and that makes sense in the world of things. But not in the space of being, because silence is not a thing, it cannot be held, it cannot be stored, cannot be repeated, and most importantly, it cannot be lost. But the mind does not understand this. To the mind, everything can be gained or lost, everything can be achieved or failed, everything can be controlled or fall apart, and so it tries to do with silence what it does with everything else. It tries to turn it into an experience, and this creates an invisible problem, because the moment silence becomes an experience, it has a beginning and an end. It becomes something that comes and then goes away. But true silence does not function like that. It does not begin, it does not end. It does not depend on conditions. It is prior to all experience, and this is where something begins to reverse, because maybe what you have been calling losing silence was never a loss. Maybe it was simply the return of identification, the return of habit, the return of the mind trying to take control again. But that does not mean that silence stopped being present. It is still there, untouched, unchanged, just covered again. And this changes everything, because if silence doesn't go away, then you don't need to bring it back. If it cannot be lost, then you don't need to protect it. And if it does not depend on you, then you don't need to maintain it. Do you see what this implies? It means that all effort is not only unnecessary, but exactly what obscures what you are looking for. And this may be difficult to accept, because the mind wants to be involved. It wants a role, it wants to say, I am doing this right, but here, it has no function, and that creates discomfort. Because it feels like you are being asked to let go of something very deep. Control. Not only control of external things, but control of your internal experience. And that can feel unsettling. As if you're losing something. As if you're giving up some kind of safety. But look closely. What are you actually losing? Control, or the illusion of control? Because if you observe carefully, you'll see that control was never truly there. Thoughts arise on their own. Emotions appear without warning. Reactions happen before you even notice. And yet, there is a sense that I am in charge. But are you, or is that also just another thought? And here we enter an even deeper point. Because when this starts to mature, something begins to relax. A relaxation that doesn't come from effort, not from technique, not from practice. It comes from seeing, just seeing that there is nothing to hold, nothing to control, nothing to maintain. And in that seeing, something lets go naturally, without trying, without deciding. And in that letting go, silence does not appear, it reveals itself, because it never left. And the more this is seen, the more something within you begins to trust, not the mind, not strategy, but something much deeper, something that needs no direction, something that needs no control, something that simply knows and still. There is one last point, a very subtle detail. If silence is real, why is there still noise? And that question opens a very important door, because maybe silence was never the absence of sound, but something entirely different. And that is exactly what we are about to step into next. And so, we arrive at a point where everything becomes even more subtle, so subtle that the mind can no longer follow in the same way, because up to this point, it feels like something is being understood. You begin to see that silence does not need to be created, that it does not depend on effort, that it is not something that comes and goes, but there is still something almost invisible that remains, a quiet sense that there is someone here, someone experiencing this, someone understanding this, someone who seems to be at the center of it all, and this someone is rarely questioned, because it feels too obvious. It feels like you. But now, let's look at this with a different depth. Not to understand, but to see. Now pause for a moment, without changing anything, without adjusting anything, without trying to enter silence, just observe. This sense of I, not the thought I, but the feeling, the sense of being someone. Where is it? Is it located somewhere? Does it have a shape? Is it solid, or is it just an impression? Notice how this sense seems to always be there, but is it really? Or does it appear only when it is thought? Stay with this, because here, there is a very deep discovery. There are moments, very simple moments, where you are not thinking about yourself, moments where there is no narrative, moments where there is no active identity, maybe when you are fully immersed in something, maybe when you are simply looking in silence, maybe when you forget yourself completely, and in those moments something is still here, presence remains, awareness remains, existence remains, but without the I, without the story, without identity, and this reveals something the mind rarely notices. The I is not continuous, it is not constant, it is not fixed, it appears and disappears, just like any other phenomenon. And this may feel unsettling because the sense of I is very convincing. It feels watch central, like a reference point, but if it can disappear, even briefly, then it cannot be what you are. And this opens a question that cannot be ignored. If you are not the thought, and not even the sense of I, then what are you? And now, don't try to answer, because any answer will just be another thought, and thought cannot capture this. So instead of answering, remain in the absence of an answer. Remain in that space where the mind cannot reach, because this is exactly where something begins to reveal itself, not as an idea, but as a direct knowing, something that does not need to be explained, something that does not need to be understood, something that simply is. And the more you remain here, without trying to escape, without trying to conclude, without trying to name it, the more something begins to dissolve. The need to define, the need to understand, the need to locate yourself as someone, and in that process, something very deep begins to fall away. The sense of a center, the feeling of I am here inside, the sense of separation, and in its place, what begins to appear is something entirely different, not as a new experience, but as recognition. There is no center, no fixed point, no separate someone living all of this. There is only experience happening, thoughts arising, sensations flowing, perceptions shifting, but without an owner, without a controller, without someone holding it all together. And this can create a kind of dizziness, a kind of emptiness, a feeling of weight. Then who am I but stay? Don't move away from this, because this, not knowing, is not a problem. It is an opening to see beyond what was always assumed, because your entire life, you were conditioned to believe there is an I, a center, an identity, someone who thinks, someone who chooses, someone who controls. But now, this is being seen differently, not as theory, but as direct perception, and as this deepens, something relaxes, deeply, because maintaining a self requires effort, requires energy, requires constant reinforcement, and now that begins to lose its grip. And in that relaxation, something very natural happens. Silence becomes even more evident, not as something you enter, but as what has always been here. Even when there was identity, even when there was thought, even when there was seeking. And this changes everything, because now, there is no need to get rid of thoughts, no need to eliminate the ego, no need to reach anything, because all of this is already happening within something that was never affected, and that cannot be named, but it can be recognized. And the more this is seen, the more a quiet freedom begins to emerge, a freedom that does not depend on conditions, a freedom that does not depend on states, a freedom that does not depend on who you think you are. And still, there is one extremely subtle detail that can go unnoticed, because even after all of this, the mind may try to rebuild itself in a more refined way, more spiritual, more invisible. It may say, now I know who I am, now I am consciousness, now I am presence. But notice, this is still identity, still a self, just more sophisticated. And this is exactly where something needs to be seen even more clearly. And so, if you have come this far, not as someone trying to understand, but as someone who simply remained, something has already begun to reveal itself, not as knowledge, not as a conclusion, but as something that can no longer be fully ignored, because there is a point where this stops being something you hear, and becomes something you perceive, directly. And that point does not happen in time. It does not come after more practice. It does not happen when you finally understand. It happens now, always now, but not as an idea, as reality. So for a moment, stop completely, not physically, but internally. Stop the impulse to seek. Stop the impulse to understand. Stop the impulse to get somewhere, and simply notice, without effort, what is already here. There is something here, before any thought, before any interpretation, before any attempt to name. And this does not depend on you, does not depend on your attention, does not depend on your state. It is here, even if you don't notice it. But now you can notice, and when you do, something very simple becomes clear. You are not creating this. You are not maintaining this. You are not making this happen. This is already happening. It always has been. Now observe even more delicately. The next thought arising, it appears, without asking, without warning, and it disappears. And what remains? Stay with that. Because this is not an intellectual question. It is a direct invitation. The thought comes and goes. The sensation comes and goes. The emotion comes and goes. But something does not come. Something does not go. Something does not change. And that something is not separate from you. It is not somewhere else. It is not hidden. It is not waiting to be found. It is what is here, before any movement. And maybe, what makes this difficult to notice is exactly how simple it is. Because the mind expects complexity, it expects process, it expects evolution, but this does not evolve, does not improve, does not become more, because it is already complete. Now notice something even more subtle. When a thought arises, there is a moment, before you engage with it, a moment where it is simply perceived, without story, without meaning, without identification. And in that moment, silence is evident, not because the thought is absent, but because you did not enter it. And this reveals something essential. The problem was never the thought, never the noise, never the mind. It was only the involvement, the identification, the habit of entering. And now, perhaps for the first time, this is being seen not as theory, but as direct experience. And in that seeing, something begins to loosen, without effort, without decision, without practice, simply because it no longer makes sense to hold. And this creates space, a space where everything can happen, without you getting lost in it. And this is freedom. But not the kind of freedom the mind imagines. Not the freedom to control. Not the freedom to choose everything. But the freedom of not needing to identify, of not needing to hold, of not needing to sustain a self. And at this point, something very quiet begins to stabilize, not as a state, but as a continuous recognition. Even if it seems to come and go, even if it sometimes feels distant, something has already been seen, and what has been seen cannot be completely unseen. And over time, not chronological time, but the maturation of this perception, something becomes natural. You no longer need to remember, no longer need to practice, no longer need to return, because there is nowhere to return to. This has always been here, and it remains, even now, while you listen, while thoughts pass, while the mind tries to understand. All of this happens within something that does not move, and that non-movement is not inertia, not absence, it is absolute presence. And maybe, if you completely stop now without intention, without expectation, without seeking, you may notice something very simple. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be completed. And that simplicity can feel unsettling, because the mind wants to do something with it, to turn it into a conclusion, to turn it into knowledge. But there is nothing to do, and that is exactly what makes this so profound. Because for the first time, you do not need to move, do not need to improve, do not need to arrive, only to recognize, and in that recognition, something stabilizes, not as effort, but as the absence of resistance, and then life continues, but without the same weight, without the same contraction, without the same need for control. Because what you are is not involved, not trapped, not limited. And this changes everything. Your relationship with thoughts, with emotions, with situations. Everything continues, but it does not define you, does not bind you, does not limit you. And maybe this is the closest we can come to calling freedom, a silent freedom, without announcement, without achievement, without identity, and yet completely present and now, without turning this into an idea, without trying to hold on to it. Remain for a moment, in silence, without doing anything with it, without trying to maintain it, without trying to repeat it. Just allow, because silence is not something you achieve, it is something that remains. When you stop interfering, gratitude for being here, much light on your path, quantum silence.